All right, there we go. So I'm here today to talk about Unicorn. You mentioned, Lars mentioned Habitat a couple of minutes ago. Unicorn is the default serialization tool that Habitat uses, and a lot of people use it outside of Habitat, but this is sort of a introduction. So if people are thinking about adopting Habitat, here's an introduction to Unicorn to give you some information about that. So first of all, serialization. Who knows what serialization is in terms of Sitecore? Okay, good, most of you. So you can tune out for the rest of the slide. So imagine you're doing Sitecore development, you're making a rendering, for example. A rendering, you're gonna need a rendering item in Sitecore, you're gonna need a view on disk, like say a view rendering for like a CS/HTML file. You're gonna need a way to push that Sitecore item for your rendering up through different environments. You can't just keep it on your local environment. You could use packages for moving Sitecore items around, but that's really cumbersome because you end up with like package version 1, package version 2, somebody forgets to install a version, and then nothing works, and it should work. So what we want to be able to do is to treat database items as if they were files, so that when we commit them to source control, then we can commit them along with our actual code and keep all of our artifacts together so that we can make sure the environment in all of our Sitecore installs is same. So Unicorn lets us do that. And the way that Unicorn works is that you have to tell it what you want to keep serialized. You don't want to keep your whole database serialized, so you have to make a choice of what you care about. Normally that would be renderings, it would be templates. In some cases, it might be some content items, developer-focused content items, things like metadata for multi-list sources and things like that. And then you have to write all of those things to the disk the first time. After that, Unicorn automatically updates changes to items you've told it to include every time you save it, move it, rename it, change template on it, anything. So what you have on your disk is always up to date with what you have inside of Sitecore. So that makes it so that when you commit and get TFS, whatever you're using, you'll have these serialized items show up in your change set along with your actual code that's in Visual Studio. So that way you can share these items with other developers. Then you have to have some way to take the items you have serialized and push them back up into another Sitecore instance, or it's useless to have them on the disk. So there's two ways that you can do that with Unicorn. One of them is called transparent sync. And if you're using transparent sync, it's completely automatic. All you have to do is change a file on disk, and we'll do this in a minute, and it will immediately be reflected in Sitecore. The second way is using traditional sync, where you use the control panel and you tell it to sync, and then it essentially pushes the state of all the serialized items up into Sitecore all at once. Usually you would use traditional sync for a deploy, transparent sync for doing development. So if you've got everything on the disk, then you're going to have merge conflicts. The big difference in the way that Unicorn handles merge conflicts is that because everything on disk is always up to date, you always are going to be forced to resolve your conflicts on the disk. That means that you can use your merge tools that your source control gives you. In a lot of cases, you may actually be able to use your source control's diff tool to fully automatically merge content changes from different developers as long as they didn't touch the same thing. The big other thing is that merge conflicts happen less often when you're using Unicorn. Traditional Sitecore serialization formats are not particularly line-oriented. Merge tools are line-oriented. Unicorn uses Rainbow, which is a custom YAML-based format. It is designed to be read by a human. The hierarchy it stores on disk is designed to be, you can figure it out as a human. Yeah, we're all humans, right? And you're merging somebody else's code. I don't know what you did. So for example, let's take a look at an example of Rainbow versus the standard format. This is a multi-list. Multi-lists are probably my single least favorite thing to do merge conflicts on. And that's because if you look, you've got content length stored on there, and then you've got all of your GUIDs stored on a single line. And when you've got that, if somebody adds a GUID, because it's all in one line, you're guaranteed a merge conflict no matter what. But if you're using Rainbow, it puts each GUID on a separate line, and it doesn't have that content length, because if you resolve a conflict in regular serialization and you forget to recalculate that content length, everything blows up, and nobody likes that. It does the same thing for layouts. It will actually pre-print the XML instead of putting it on a single line, including the attributes, and that makes it so even more things can be automatically merged by your source control system. And because slides are really, really boring, I'd rather just write code. So let's go write code. We're going to take Unicorn and sort of go through a development cycle with it, from having it just installed in Visual Studio to doing continuous integration and deploying it. So all I've done so far in this solution, this is a standard Sitecore 8.1 update 2. I installed it with Sitecore Instance Manager. I installed Unicorn, and I pre-made a couple of Unicorn configurations. So let's take a look at this sample configuration. Unicorn uses the idea of multiple configurations. Each configuration, you can tell it what you want to include in it. For example, this predicate here, where we've got this include, tells it to pull in that path at the end of the line and include it in the master database. You can put multiple includes in there. You can have multiple configurations, so it gives you the ability to separate. In the case of Habitat specifically, Habitat creates a configuration for each feature, a configuration for each, most of the foundations will have some. So essentially you can take Habitat out of its Git repository, run a couple of build cycles, and Unicorn will sync as part of that, and it will push all of Habitat into a stock Sitecore with just a couple of clicks. The configuration setup is internally kind of like a IOC container. So there's a whole bunch of dependencies. If we look under the Unicorn folder here at the unicorn.config, anything under this defaults node here are all the default dependencies, and any configuration will inherit all those by default. So if you want to patch anything about the way Unicorn works, the way it syncs items, the way that it saves items, you can do all that in any configuration and change the behavior compared with what it does by default. Everything's heavily commented, perhaps too commented in some cases. So let's enable this configuration that will include the sample renderings folder that comes with Sitecore. And if we go over here to our control panel, when we started out, we had no configurations. If I refresh this, now that we've activated the configuration, it's going to tell us we can't do anything with it because there's no items that have been serialized yet, because we told it to include an already existing item in Sitecore. If there's nothing on disk, it's going to protect you from doing the bad thing of syncing it, because if you sync it when there's no items on disk, that means it's going to delete everything. You probably don't want that. So it says here there are no valid serialized items. Can everybody see that up in the back? Okay, good. And if you go down here, it shows you the configuration you've got to make sure everything is okay. For example, like what the physical file route is, so you know where it's going. And if we do the initial serialization, it will go and serialize things. We'll take a look here on disk at what we've got. So we've got this, we called the configuration SUGCON artifacts, so we've got a folder for that. We called the include my renderings with the name attribute, so we've got that. And then we've got the actual serialized files. In this case, the sample is the root of all of this stuff. And it's the Sitecore layout rendering sample item. And it's got all of its shared fields. It has its Danish version and Japanese version that come with Sitecore by default. And the format is relatively easy to read. So now let's take Sitecore and make ourselves a rendering so that we add something interesting to this. Actually, we'll do a commit first to get all these other things out of the way. So I've got this in a Git repository, and this is Git extensions, which is my favorite Git client. And we'll just commit. So we renamed the config file, and we added these two files. Use a better commit message than me. So now we've got these sample renderings serialized. And we'll go and load up the sample item and take a look at its content to show you an important thing about Unicorn. So it puts these content editor warnings here. to show you what items are included in a configuration or not, because there are certain situations where, for example, a content editor might be trying to edit an item that Unicorn is controlled under. When you push the state of the disk in Unicorn up in, so like if you're doing a deployment with CI and you tell Unicorn to sync, if somebody's changed one of those items, it's going to get reverted back to be exactly like what's on the disk. There's occasionally times where somebody will go do something bad, like try to change a template on a deployed server, and then Unicorn will come and undo their changes because they never pushed it back to dev. I'd say that's a feature, not a bug, but they have a warning, you know. So let's create a rendering in here so that we can do some actual development. We're going to use a method rendering just to be unusual. A method rendering is the only, well, other than an XSLT, it's the only kind of rendering you could use in web forms and MVC unmodified. And we will set up a really simple, so the method here is render. The class is, I can type. So we'll save that. We've got a rendering. I've already made the method for it. And so I will commit that, and we'll see that it's added this one item, and it's got all of these values set in it. But there's a problem. I actually called the class demo, not demonstration. So if we go and edit it, we'll just pull out Sublime Text because it's quick. We'll change it here to just be demo. Save it. And if we go back here in Sitecore, it will actually be already updated because it's watching for file changes. See, it's saying demo now instead of demonstration. So it's using transparent sync to watch for file changes. It handles all the Sitecore item cache expiration and all of that stuff to get it immediately up in there. We'll commit this, and now we've made a rendering, which is an amazing piece of Sitecore development to have created one item. So we need to do code review on this. So we want to be nice to our code review partner, and we want to give them a sample page that they can see this on. But the sample page is something that you don't necessarily want to have be made to look exactly like the state of the database. In this case, you might, if you want it to be something like the target for a Selenium test or something like that. But a lot of cases, you're pushing some piece of content that once it's pushed, you want the editors to have control over it and not the developers. So that if somebody makes changes to the content of the item, it will actually not change next time a deploy happens. So imagine if you're syncing like a shared metadata folder or something like that, the developer wants to push a multi-list of items, but then once the items are pushed, they become the property of the content owners. Unicorn has a feature for that that is called the new items only evaluator. So remember when I said you could take any configuration and it's an IOC container, you can change whatever you want about the way it works. In this case, we're patching in a different evaluator here that changes the way that when a sync happens, it evaluates what's changed. So every time there's a new item found or a changed item found or a deleted item found, it's going to invoke the evaluator to decide what to do. The default evaluator decides to make everything look like the disk. In this case, the new item only evaluator says, if it's new, write it. Otherwise, just ignore it. Don't do anything. So we've got this configuration we made, and we've put Sitecore content home under it. And we've set up the new item only evaluator. And in this case, we've turned off transparent sync because, as you might imagine, if you have transparent sync going on, it literally is reading the item files on disk into Sitecore instantly. So there's no way to have it ignore item changes because literally it's a data provider reading from the items on disk in real time. So you have to turn transparent sync off if you're going to customize the evaluator because it's not even used in that case. So we've got that, and we need to go and do an initial serialization just like we did for the last configuration so that Sitecore content home gets written. We'll have to wait for Sitecore to cycle here. That wasn't too bad for Sitecore 8. So now we've got two configurations. We've got them serialized. We've got SUGCON artifacts that we just made and SUGCON content, which means that now if we go under the Sitecore content home item, there'll be a content editor warning on there saying it's part of a new item only configuration. So the content editor warnings are different depending on how you are syncing it. And there's actually a switch you can flip on this called production mode that changes them even further. So the idea is you turn production mode on when you've deployed it, and it changes the messages to, instead of be developer facing, to be content editor facing. So if I change this to production mode, instead of saying changes will not be synced unless the item needs to be created, it would say something along the lines of, you know, this is part of Unicorn. Unicorn created this item, but feel free to mess with it unless you're going to delete it, in which case talk to a developer. Because if you delete it, it becomes a new item again, it'll get re-added back in. So we've got this home item, and we'll create a sample page for this rendering that we made. We'll call it SUGCON, and we'll experience editor it. So here's the standard Sitecore 8 page, which is extremely exciting. I know it has much personalization on it. We'll add a new rendering, put it right at the top. Pick our SUGCON rendering, we add it under sample, and then we'll have fun. I didn't know if I'd have internet, so I didn't use Giphy. So we'll save that, and it will write John's keyboard to the disk, and we'll commit it. In the interest of time, I won't show you that the evaluator won't change it unless I delete it, but you'll have to take my word for that. Again, don't make commit comments like me. So now we have basically done the actions of a single developer creating a new rendering, putting trollish content on it, creating a sample page to go troll Camrose with when he does my code review, and then committed it. So now we've got a second Sitecore instance that I've created called Sitecore 2 that is also a Git repository. And I went full out John on this. So you can see the origin on this Git repository is actually the Sitecore 1 site. And so we'll just pull, actually we'll fetch. Yes, this is TFS. And then we'll see, we can see that we got the new branch of feature SUGCON. So we were developing that on a feature branch. So we'll check out feature branch. And now we're reviewing my code. So now I'm going to play Camrose here, who's the real author of Unicorn. And we're going to go do this code review. So if I go here to my Sitecore 2, I'm going to prove to you that this page doesn't actually exist yet. And I'll meanwhile load up the desktop for it. And we need Unicorn 2 while we're at it. So now we've got, in Sitecore 2, it brought across our configurations. These didn't exist before. And under here, if I go to /SUGCON, it'll be a 404, because it doesn't actually exist. You heckling down there? This is stock Sitecore. Okay, so in the name of the presentation, we're going to sync all the things, which is actually a button that syncs all the configurations. So we got the sync run, and it basically went and added our sample rendering, it added our sample content item, and then it actually auto-published everything. Auto-publish is turned on by default, and basically what it does is it takes any item that got synced and throws it into the publish queue, and then it kicks off an incremental publish. So it only publishes changed items. It's relatively fast in that way. And it will tell you exactly what happened. So it will tell you that there were 2 new items, 17 updated items, because there seems like there's always a lot of updated items, no matter what, in a publish. no comment. So now that we've got that sync, and because it auto-published, we can actually refresh this without even signing in, and we will get a broken page. That's because somebody forgot to open the right solution and build it, because it's a method rendering, and we didn't actually have the demo item in there until we pulled the branch. I totally should have, shouldn't I? And then I forgot to save my project too, so my config files will disappear, but they won't be hurt. So if I build this, we can have cameras yell at me for forgetting to commit my CS proj changes, right? So if I refresh it now, once we wait for Sitecore to start up, we should get John West and his keyboard. And if you don't recognize John West and his keyboard, you can go look at the Sitecore selfie video that Sean Holmesby and Mike Reynolds did a couple of years ago for Symposium. This is a clip out of that. You guys are hilarious. So we've got John. We've successfully pulled this across, but Camrose is more detailed than me. So he went and looked really closely at this rendering and saw that there's a semicolon rendering after that. I mean, come on, I got to get with this coding thing. So we'll go and fix that. Go look at our view. And look, somebody left a semicolon. That lazy programmer. So we built it. We refresh it, we should be good to go. Again, a reasonable startup time for Sitecore 8. I need more CPU. This is a lot of time for just a semicolon. There we go. Now there is no more hidden sneaky semicolon down here. And so being a nice guy, Camrose is going to fix my bugs and commit them, right? Oh, that's Sitecore 1. So now we've got the demo file that we fixed. We'll say fix and nasty bugs. That one, of course. So now we've committed that. We'll open our git bash here, and we'll say that this went through a pull request. So we'll check out, if I can spell, master. And we'll merge our feature. It will complain because I left Sublime Text open, I think. Okay, maybe not. I'll try closing Visual Studio. And if that doesn't work, we'll just deploy from the branch. Okay, we'll just deploy from the branch. All right, so the next thing we have to do after we've approved the code is we've got to deploy it. So pretty much everyone, at least I hope pretty much everyone, is using continuous integration and has got some kind of server that is deploying their stuff as it gets checked in and approved on some kind of branch. We'd use the master branch, except that file permissions are being weird. I've got a copy of Jenkins on here, which is a continuous integration server. I have set it up so that it looks for the Sitecore 2. I will change this so that it looks for the future SUGCON branch. And then essentially all that it does is it uses MS-build to build the solution file that comes with it. And then it calls this world's laziest CI batch file. It really is the world's laziest CI. It's about 4 lines. And I'll show that to you. So the world's laziest CI basically robocopies all of the things in the web root. It robocopies all the serialized items, and then it calls this sync process. The sync process is actually part of Unicorn's PowerShell API. It has a PowerShell module that is used to execute deployments, which I'd be happy to show you. So the sync PS1 here is just a couple of lines. It literally just imports this Unicorn PowerShell module, and then it calls the sync Unicorn commandlet, passes it the URL to the control panel that you, on the instance you wanted. So in this case, we have a third instance called Sitecore CI that we're going to deploy to. It uses a shared secret that you set up in side of Sitecore, well, inside the configurations to it. I can show you that. Since I don't have Visual Studio on, we'll just go to it manually. So here, there is a sample of this secret file that ships with Unicorn. It's not enabled by default. In fact, by default, remote access with PowerShell is turned off for security. So if you want it, there's instructions in the README, and basically just enable this patch file, generate a really, really long secret key. It's actually required to be at least 32 characters, and then it will allow you to use the remote API. The remote API uses CHAP authentication, so it's sending a signature based on the shared secret, not the actual shared secret over the wire. So it's better than nothing if you're using HTTP, but ideally you should still make this call over HTTPS. So let's do our world's laziest CI. Here's hoping that I typed the branch name incorrectly. Who here has had a CI build work the first time? You're a bastard. So now it's gone through and it's done all the robocopies, which are actually really fast. It took about 6 seconds to do the robocopies because I'd already copied the site once, so most of it was just checking file dates. And then it's actually now starting up Sitecore using the Unicorn API to create the challenge and the signature, and then it's basically going through and syncing all the configurations. And you can see that it went through here and it did in the logs, it added our sample rendering, it created our sample content, and then it did the same auto-publish. Basically exactly what we did when we did code review, except doing it via CI. And if we go to our Sitecore CI site, and I didn't show you that it didn't exist on this site, but you can take my word for it, that before this page didn't exist. And we've got John West deployed the CI. What? So now we've taken a very, very, very simple piece of Sitecore development and pushed it through the whole development cycle. We've got it out to a dev server. In real life, you probably would also be using some kind of continuous process to be doing deployment out beyond there, whether it's a script or actually another CI server or whatever. It's the same process called the PowerShell API for that. And that is Unicorn in a nutshell. So let's jump back to the presentation here for a second. So it's kind of become tradition after the SUGCON US to bring something fun along with Unicorn. I did something a little bit interesting for this. The Sitecore hackathon happened earlier this year, and I volunteered to be one of the community judges. So I couldn't enter the hackathon, but during the time the hackathon was running, I thought it would be fun to like join the people who were in the hackathon in hacking my own little project. That project I've done a lot of fixing on and a lot of modifications since then, but today I would like to show you Unicorn roles and Unicorn users. So Unicorn normally works on Sitecore items. This extends it to work with roles and users the same way that it works on items. It basically changes everything to be YAML, just like the standard format, like Sitecore can serialize roles and users. This changes that format to YAML. It also reverses the role serialization order. How many people have serialized roles? Okay, some. Have you ever run into the problem where you're creating a role for, say, your site, but then in order to serialize the fact that that role is a member of, say, Sitecore content editing, you also have to serialize Sitecore content editing? Yeah, it's kind of a pain because you pretty much have to serialize all the system roles because the roles serialize with the roles that belong to that role in it instead of the role being a member of the other roles, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The YAML format inverts that. So if you serialize, say, my site editors, then it's going to serialize my site editors with is a member of Sitecore content authors, Sitecore content designing, or whatever you needed to assign it of default system roles. So it makes it much easier to compartmentalize serializing your site's roles, and you can use this to deploy workflows or whatever else you can imagine where you might need roles. You can also serialize users. That one's a bit more of an edge casey thing. The default user serialization deserializes the users with a default password. Does anybody guess what that default password is? Yeah, it's B. Sean Holmesby knows this. You probably don't want to be creating new users with a password B. So the unicorn user format actually defaults to a password of random. So it'll generate a 32-character random string and set it. That means you won't be able to log in until you reset it. But I think that's a feature, not a bug. You can also hard code a password if you want. You probably shouldn't. And another thing about the users and roles, a lot of the user stuff was actually contributed by a member of the Habitat dev team. It was a pull request that he pushed in. And so thank you, Oleg, for the contribution. These are separate NuGet packages if you wish to install them. They are released as of today with Unicorn 3.2. Unicorn 3.2 does not include a whole lot that is new from 3.1 except for the users and roles stuff. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Should we demo the Mike Reynolds here? Okay, so I made a really quick users and roles demo. I decided we pick on Lars Nielsen because he's here, and why not? You're welcome. You're welcome. So we want to give Lars access to our website, but we all know it's bad to work as an admin. You'll have to bear with my crazily large console window here. Perhaps I can actually get what I'm doing on screen. All right, so we pulled this roles branch. If we go over to our Sitecore 2 and take a look at our control panel, this is actually pulled in another configuration, which we'll need to show you and what that looks like. Actually, we already have it here. We'll just do Sublime. Sublime's fast to start up. So we've got this SUGCON security set up. It's a little hard to read if I can't switch it to XML. Let me see if I can remember how to set the language. There we go, syntax. There we go. So we've got this role predicate. This works pretty much exactly the same way as the normal item predicate, except that you're including roles. The user predicate works exactly the same way. You specify what domain you wish to serialize, and then you specify optionally a pattern. The pattern is a regex, so it is the part after the domain. So in this case, it would be in the role predicate, it would be including roles in the Sitecore domain that start with SUGCON. And in the case of Lars, we're just including Lars directly. Because no, we didn't need to give Peter access, for example. So if we go and sync this configuration, so a security user and role configuration does not have to include items, but may. So if you have like a workflow configuration or something, you can include both items. There's a predicate you can use that basically includes no items, which we used here. And then you can see that it added a role called SUGCON author, and it added a user for Lars. In this case, we'll go, now we can go sign in as Lars. And let's see, the password is the password is not B. And now we're signed in as Lars to this Sitecore, and we've granted him the ability to edit things. We'll go and take a look at our serialized items so you can kind of understand how this works. By default, the serialized items go under app data unicorn, and the roles and users go in a separate folder under each one. You can obviously change that. There is a config file that ships with Unicorn that gives an example of how to do that. So in this case, we've got this SUGCON author, and you can see that we've created a role, and it's a member of 3 other roles that are granting rights to be able to do experience editor and authoring inside of the Sitecore admin. And you can see that Lars can now go and edit, make the Sitecore experience platform rock, and save that. So he's got the right to do things to the site from serialization. And that is what I had. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the sponsors for making this happen. We've got 5 minutes or so for questions. And as a special present, Akshay has got shirts for anybody who asks a question that loudly proclaim that you are an incompetent developer. Questions? Good question. The question is, how do you deal with Windows's file path limitation of 240 characters? The way that it deals with that is it will actually loop the path back. So if the path becomes too long, it will take the children of the item where the path became too long and stick it in the root of the serialized folder named by the item ID that was the parent that became too long. And then the tree basically restarts at that level. So you have the whole, all the children of that item and so on will go under there, and it can loop an unlimited number of times. So however nested your items get or however crazy long your item names get, you're covered. Yes, and you can also set it to truncate the item name length. Web Forms for Marketers is notorious for if you make a very, very long named field, it can actually become such a large number of characters in the item name that it is itself too long to fit on the file system. So by default, it actually truncates item names on disk to the first 30 characters so that it gets around that problem. Questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
We've all got crazy customers and they want to be admins, even though they shouldn't be admins. We make it running read-only mode. So if they try to edit in Sitecore, it just says, nah.
You could probably implement a pipeline for that, probably in Save UI, that would basically return false. I elected to not build that in by default, but there is, I think I built one that is there that when you turn production mode on, if you try to save a unicorn item, it will actually pop up saying, you really shouldn't do this. Are you sure about that? I left the option to do it because, you know, there's always the time when as a developer, you actually do have to break the rules and change a little thing in production to avoid, you know, another full deployment. You're going to change it in source control too, though, right?
So what about the elephant in the room being the primary sponsor?
How is that an elephant in the room?
How is your relationship?
I like the hedgehog, guys. Next question. Mm-hmm. Chris Van de Steeg and Jason Burt have worked on tools to make Courier work with the new YAML format, and so there is support for that. Yes. The question is, should Sitecore incorporate this format? I would say yes, they should. If they want to take it, it is MIT licensed. Be my guest.
I was just wondering, I think Hedgehog also has a serialization product that competes with this, and I was just wondering if we could, how are you going to relate those two things? Is one replace the other?
They have aspects of each other. TDS 5.5, like for example, with AutoSync, brought in some of the capabilities of Unicorn as well. It's mostly a matter of whether you prefer to work in Visual Studio or not, and whether you want the other additional non-serialization features that TDS includes, like some of the deployment things, and the code gen and all that other stuff.
Can you do anything in Unicorn or Rainbow to help with the line ending issues of rich text fields and Git?
Good question. Yes, Unicorn is fully capable of handling all line endings. It actually, random bit of ephemeral trivia, can handle macOS 9 style line endings where it's just a line feed. Because there was actually, one of my tests when I was developing it is I serialized all of the core and master databases, and I had one item blow up from the core database, and it was because there was actually a description written with OS 9 style line feed line endings in there, and I had not known how to handle that, so I made it handle that. So you do not need a Git attributes file with it. Yes, last question.
I know that you Unicorn kind of concept of dependency between the predicates.
Yes.
But they don't kind of fall back on each other by default. Have you done this, is it on purpose, or do you plan to work further on this? To be able to, okay, I want this predicate to be synced, but then it pulls in all those other predicates.
Yes, so the question is about dependencies between configurations. If you have multiple configurations, you can declare that other configurations depend on this one. So in Habitat, as a good example, there's foundation.serialization, which is like all the root items for Habitat. All of the other configurations depend on that, so that one will sync first. But to Adam's question, the use of dependencies does not mean that all the configurations are forced to sync. So if you sync something alone that depends on foundation.serialization, it does not force foundation to sync. What it means is if you sync them both, they'll go in dependency order, so foundation will sync first. And at the moment, I have no plans to make that be a hard link. The reason being because there are legitimate reasons to sync something without its dependencies. For example, in Habitat, if you've already synced foundation.serialization, you probably don't need to sync it again because it's probably not going to change. All right, thank you very much.